There's a federal law that forces a company to tell you, in writing, exactly what's inside a package of hot dogs at the grocery store. Beef, pork, poultry, byproducts, all itemized, no exceptions, checked by federal meat inspectors before it ever reaches a shelf anywhere in the country. Walk 200 feet to the drive-thru and order the identical tasting hot dog from a chain like Wiener Schnitzel or Sonic, and that same federal government only requires one thing on the menu: the calorie count. Nothing about what's actually in it, what it's made from, or where it came from. Tonight we're ordering from 5 hot dog chains that are counting on you never noticing that gap, and 3 places that would pass the stricter test anyway. No loophole required. Here's the rule that makes this whole episode possible, or rather, the rule that quietly stops applying the moment you walk into a restaurant. The USDA has a real, detailed standard for hot dogs. If a Frankfurter contains raw meat byproducts or a meaningful amount of mechanically separated poultry, federal law requires every one of those ingredients to be individually spelled out on the product's label. That's the rule for the package in your grocery store's cooler, and it's been on the books in some form for decades, tightened over the years as consumers pushed back on vague ingredient lists. In 2010, Congress passed a completely different law for restaurants, and it went into effect for chains with 20 or more locations back in 2018 after years of rulemaking and delay. Post the calories. That's it. Other nutrients, fat, sodium, sugar, protein, only have to be handed over in writing if a customer specifically asks, and in the real world, almost nobody asks. Nothing in that restaurant law requires a single word about what species of meat, what byproducts, or what's actually blended into the hot dog you're eating in the car. The label law and the menu law were written years apart to solve 2 completely different problems by 2 different parts of the federal government that don't seem to have compared notes with each other along the way. The gap between them is exactly where tonight's 5 chains live, comfortably, without breaking a single rule. So that's the loophole running through this whole video. A hot dog chain can call something premium, signature, or all-American, and never have to prove a word of it, because the only federal requirement that applies to them is a number printed next to the price on a menu board. 5 different chains have built 5 different businesses around that exact gap, at 5 very different price points, and every one of them stays completely within the law doing it. Let's start with the chains leaning hardest on that gap and work up to the one that recently went through federal bankruptcy court. Sonic sells what it calls a signature premium beef hot dog, a chili cheese coney, and an all-American dog, and none of those names are independently verified by anyone outside the company because nothing requires them to be. Here's what actually caught my attention doing the research for this one. Sonic runs corn dog promotions constantly. 50 cents one Halloween, 99 cents on random Tuesdays throughout 2025, a standing app deal advertising a $1 corn dog against a normal price of $2.49. Run the math on that gap. A product can only be discounted that steeply, that often, if the everyday price was built with enormous room to spare in the first place. That's not a scandal, and Sonic isn't doing anything 100 other chains don't also do. It's only what happens when a menu item never has to justify its price or its ingredients to anyone but the person deciding what to charge for it that week. If you think Sonic's the only one playing that game, the next chain calls itself the world's largest hot dog chain, and it's running a version of the exact same one at a slightly bigger scale. Wiener Schnitzel's own press releases describe its hot dogs as crafted in family-owned American production facilities, which sounds specific and reassuring right up until you notice it doesn't actually name a single facility, a single family, or a single verifiable fact you could go check yourself before your next visit. Founded in 1961 by John Gallardi with one stand in Wilmington, California, the company now serves more than 120 million hot dogs a year across roughly 350 locations in 10 states, and it markets aggressively on value. 4 chili dogs for $4 on National Hot Dog Day. Combo deals at $4, $6, and $8 for Labor Day. Promotions timed to holidays throughout the calendar year. Read the fine print on those same promotions though. No substitutions, cheese extra, tax extra, only redeemable in specific multiples on specific days of a specific month. None of that is illegal, and none of it is unusual for the industry. All of it is designed deliberately to make the sticker price look better than the number you actually pay standing at the window with cheese on your chili dog. Nathan's Famous carries more brand history and more genuine cultural weight than either of the first two chains combined, which makes what's actually happening underneath that history worth taking seriously. The company runs somewhere around 250 franchise restaurants, and that part of the business is genuinely well run and well regulated by the franchise agreement, with real training standards and real oversight. But Nathan's own federal filings say something else entirely about a much bigger part of the business. The company's branded product program doesn't collect royalties the way its franchise program does. Instead, Nathan's sells hot dog product directly to food service distributors who resell it to whoever wants to slap the Nathan's Famous name on a menu board. More than 13,000 points of sale in total, according to the company's own franchise materials, including vending machines, Subway counters inside Walmart stores, and Auntie Anne's pretzel shops. None of those operators are trained the way an actual Nathan's franchisee is trained. None of them are held to the same operational standards a franchise agreement would enforce, because there's no franchise agreement in play at all, only a limited trademark license attached to a wholesale hot dog order. But the hot dog in front of you at any one of those 13,000 locations still says Nathan's Famous either way, built on more than 100 years of reputation earned at one stand in Coney Island, stretched thin across thousands of counters that never had to earn that reputation the same way the original did. 3 down, and every single one is leaning on a name doing more work than the actual food behind the counter, whether that's a beef claim nobody checks or a trademark stretched across thousands of counters the company itself doesn't operate. The 4th one charges you triple for the exact same lack of transparency, dressed up in nicer packaging. Doghouse deserves real credit here, and I want to say that plainly before I get to the catch. The company actually names its beef supplier, Creekstone Farms, and describes the beef as genetically tested, humanely raised, hormone and antibiotic free. That's a specific, checkable claim, more transparency than most chains on this list bother to offer their customers. Founded in 2010 out of a Pasadena food truck by 3 friends, Doghouse took a private equity investment from a firm called Carp Riley back in 2018 to fund its national expansion, and it now charges a meaningful premium for what it calls craft casual dining, positioned deliberately between fast food and a sit-down restaurant. Here's the part worth knowing before you order through an app though. Close to half of Doghouse's total company revenue now comes from virtual, delivery-only sub-brands operating out of the exact same physical kitchens. Names like Badass Breakfast Burritos and Bad Mother Clucka, marketed on delivery apps as if they're entirely separate restaurants with their own locations. You're paying a real premium for the Doghouse name specifically, in a kitchen that might be filling 3 other brands' orders in the same 10 minutes, and nothing in the app's presentation makes that especially obvious to the person placing the order. Restaurant chains don't come with a kitchen test the way a jar of peanut butter or a bottle of ketchup does, because you can't run a coffee filter test on a hot dog you already ate in the car. What you can do instead is compare receipts, and it turns out that's exactly where a real, federally documented gap is hiding for this entire category. Here's something you can actually check for yourself before your next order. No special equipment required. Pull up any of these chains on a delivery app, add a hot dog to your cart, and get all the way to checkout without hitting confirm. Then compare that final number to what the same exact item costs walking up to the counter in person, same day, same location. The Federal Trade Commission settled with Grubhub for $25 million at the end of 2024 over exactly this kind of gap, advertising a low or free delivery cost and then adding fees the customer never saw coming until the final screen. Chicago separately got $18 million out of DoorDash in a 2025 settlement for failing to disclose that its app prices could run higher than the same restaurant's in-store menu, on top of allegations about listing restaurants without their permission in the first place. And this past April, the FTC proposed a brand new rule after finding that delivery orders can run anywhere from 20% to, in some cited studies, over 90% more than picking the same order up yourself. I want to be fair here because that's the standard I'm holding every chain in this video to. None of that is a specific accusation against any one restaurant on tonight's list. It's a documented, agency-confirmed pattern across the entire delivery industry, verified by federal regulators, not something this channel is claiming about any single hot dog chain by name. But it means the receipt in your hand after a delivery order and the receipt you get walking through the door aren't testing the same thing, and only one of them tells you what the food actually costs before the app's math gets involved. 4 chains in, all leaning on a name, a discount, or a fee structure to make the math work in their favor, and all 4 operating well inside a regulatory gap this episode has been mapping out from the start. The 5th one recently finished a very public trip through federal bankruptcy court, and it's worth slowing down for, because this is the strongest paper trail in the entire episode. Hot Dog on a Stick started in 1946 on Muscle Beach in Santa Monica, when a man named Dave Barham started frying his mother's cornbread recipe around a hot dog and selling it to people relaxing on the sand, decades before anyone had coined the phrase food truck. It's a genuinely sweet origin story, and for decades it turned into a real Southern California institution, then a national mall food court name recognizable to anyone who grew up wearing the brand's tricolor paper hat behind the counter on a summer job. Then it started getting sold. Global Franchise Group owned it from 2014 to 2021. Then Fat Brands bought it in 2021, folding it into a growing portfolio of more than a dozen restaurant chains acquired the same way. By this year, the location count had shrunk from a peak of over 100 stores down to somewhere between 37 and 44, worn down by expensive mall leases in a dying retail format and a parent company that, by every account I found researching this, treated it as a footnote rather than a priority. Here's where it gets serious, and where this stops being only a story about a corn dog stand. Fat Brands filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in a Texas federal court on January 26th of this year, carrying more than $1 billion in debt. The company's own founder and CEO was forced out as part of the restructuring negotiations, along with several board members and family employees. The court held an auction in April, approved 4 separate sale deals in May worth close to $1 billion combined, and Hot Dog on a Stick specifically, the brand, the name, the recipe, the paper hats, sold at auction for $8 million in cash to a company called Amazing Brands. One creditor actually objected in court, arguing $8 million was far too low against a $20 million lien it held specifically on the California stores, and characterized the financing behind that lien as fraudulently arranged shortly before the bankruptcy filing. That's the creditor's own allegation made in an actual court filing, not something this channel is asserting as established fact. But it tells you plainly what tonight's 5th chain has actually been through. Nearly a decade of being bought, folded into a larger portfolio, and shuffled between owners who had nothing to do with the actual hot dog, until a federal bankruptcy judge finally had to sort out who owned which pieces. 5 chains, 5 different ways of making the math work in their favor, and every single one of them stayed completely legal doing it, because almost none of what we covered here is something the law actually requires them to disclose. To be fair to all 5, none of them broke a rule that exists. That's precisely the problem this whole episode is about. The rule that would make them prove any of it was never written for restaurants in the first place at all. So let's go find 3 places that would hold up even under a much stricter test, the kind of test that was never actually required of any of them. Of the 3 places we're about to cover, this is the one people are least likely to think of as a hot dog chain in the first place, and that's part of why it belongs here. Costco's hot dog and soda combo has cost $1.50 since 1985, and it has never once gone up, through 4 decades of inflation that would have made almost any other food business double or triple that price by now without a second thought. Founder Jim Sinegal reportedly told his own CEO years later that he'd kill him if the price ever changed. A story Costco's own executives have repeated on the record more than once in interviews since 2018, because it's become part of how the company talks about itself to investors, employees, and customers alike. Here's the part that actually impressed me doing this research. Costco didn't only eat the cost increases quietly and hope nobody noticed the shrinking margin. It built its own hot dog manufacturing plants specifically to protect that $1.50, one outside Los Angeles and a second later in the Chicago area, moving away from a third-party supplier and taking production entirely in-house so the company itself controls the cost rather than a vendor. Costco reportedly sold around 245 million of these combos last year alone. That's not a loss leader gimmick buried in a larger business. That's a company that restructured its own supply chain rather than break a 40-year-old promise to its customers. If Costco proves a low price doesn't require cutting corners, Portillo's proves a beloved regional name can keep its actual recipe intact even after Wall Street gets involved. Portillo's started in 1963 in Villa Park, Illinois, when a man named Dick Portillo opened a stand called the Dog House out of a small trailer with no running water, financed with a few $100s and a lot of determination. It grew into one of the most recognizable Chicago-style hot dog names in the country, and it's still recognizably built around that original recipe. The same char-grilled Vienna beef franks, the same Italian beef, the same green relish nobody outside Chicago quite understands. I do need to disclose the current picture honestly though, the same way I would for any brand on this channel. Portillo's is now a public company traded on the NASDAQ, and a private equity firm called Berkshire Partners owns 72% of it. The founder's name is still on the building and still on the food. The company writing most of the checks and making most of the strategic decisions isn't the Portillo family anymore. Both things are true at the same time, and you deserve to know both before you decide how much of the nostalgia you're actually paying for. The third pick on this list never grew past one location, and that's exactly the point after everything we've covered tonight. Superdog opened in Chicago in 1948, when a young couple named Maury and Flory Berman started a drive-in as a way to pay their way through Northwestern University. Maury studying to become an accountant, Flory training to become a Chicago public schools teacher. Maury had fought in the Battle of the Bulge only a few years earlier, one of the millions of veterans who came home from the war and quietly started small businesses instead of writing memoirs about it. What was supposed to be a summer job turned into a lifelong business that outlasted the both of them. And decades later, family members were still describing him, in his own obituary, as the fun-loving, generous guy who genuinely cared about making sure people wanted to come back for another one. It's remained a single-location Chicago institution at its original address this entire time, standing on a corner while the drive-ins around it disappeared one by one, never chasing the kind of national licensing deal that spreads a name across 13,000 counters it can't actually control. Here's a regulatory contrast worth knowing before you order your next hot dog anywhere, including overseas. In the European Union, restaurants aren't only restaurants when it comes to allergies. European law requires every food business, cafes and hot dog stands included, not only packaged goods sellers, to disclose in writing whether a dish contains any of 14 major allergens, a rule that's been in force across all EU member states since December of 2014, and got tightened further 2 years after that, when verbal answers alone from a counter worker stopped being considered good enough. A customer with a wheat or dairy allergy walking into a hot dog stand in Berlin or Madrid has an actual legal right to written proof of what's in that bun, backed by an entire continent's worth of enforcement and inspection behind it. There is no equivalent federal requirement here in the United States, and there's been no serious legislative push in recent years to add one, even as food allergies among American children and adults have become more widely recognized and more commonly discussed. Our restaurant law, the one we've spent this whole episode picking apart piece by piece, stops at the calorie count and goes no further than that single number. A written, legally enforceable answer to the simple question, what's actually in this? Just not here. So here's what to actually do the next time you're pulling up to a drive-thru or standing at a food court counter deciding between 5 familiar names. You can't flip a hot dog chain's menu board over the way you can flip a package at the grocery store because the law doesn't make them print an ingredient list anywhere you can see it. What you can do is ask out loud before you order. A chain confident in what it's actually serving you will usually tell you plainly if you take 10 seconds to ask what's in the hot dog and where it actually comes from. A chain that's been counting on you never asking usually can't answer the question at all, or answers it with the same vague marketing language printed on the menu board itself. You don't need to memorize 5 chains to skip or 3 to trust, and you definitely don't need to give up hot dogs over any of this, because a hot dog is one of the great, simple pleasures of an American summer, and no regulatory gap changes that. You need one habit: ask before you order, and pay close attention to how fast and how specifically you actually get an answer.